thank you so much for braving the very Ithacan weather to come to this talk, and we're really thankful to our distinguished guest for coming back to Cornell to spend more time with us, and really delighted to be able to welcome Professor Abdullahi An-Na'im, who will give a lecture this evening and also a seminar tomorrow morning. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our speaker, although he needs no introduction, really, but originally from Sudan. He's the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Law at Emory Law School, where he's also at Emory University an Associated Professor in the College of Arts and Sciences. And he also directs the Center the Center for International Comparative Law, and is also Senior Fellow for the Center of the Study of Law and Religion. He teaches in the areas of human rights, comparative law, and Islamic law, and his research interests include constitutionalism in Islamic and African countries, secularism, and Islam and politics. And he is the author of many, many works, many books and articles, including most recently, What is an American Muslim? That just came out this year. And also Muslims and Global Justice from 2011, Islam and the Secular State from 2008, and African Constitutionalism and the Role of Islam, among many, many other works. So I would recommend all of this reading to you. He's really an internationally recognized scholar of Islam and human rights in cross-cultural perspectives. So without further ado, welcome Professor An-Na'im.
Just if I may mention, tomorrow there will be a seminar on Islam and secularism between 10 and 12. And it's at the Toboggan Lodge where the ICM is located. So some of you are interested.
Yes. Oh,
the reception tonight.
Yes, I think I'm also supposed to mention there's reception after this in the History of Art Gallery, which is just outside next door. No, not outside the building, don't worry. Outside next door in the building.
Okay, thank you all for being here. Good evening, Assalamu alaikum.
The microphone is working?
I thought it is, yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Shall I do it like this, or maybe I just hold it so you can. Is that better? Okay. This mysterious coming back business, because Chantal already said that.
I think it's making noise. Maybe you just put it. Let's close to your mouth.
So there is a coming back, is a return of something. That last year I was here, and just before the public lecture, I had an incident with my medication that sent me to the emergency room. It wasn't serious, but I missed the lecture. It was my fault, I have to admit. So I offered this year that if I may come back to try to give the lecture I failed to give last year. But as it turned out, and the reason that's why I mentioned this, the lecture I'm going to give today, or rather for our discussion, is not exactly the lecture I would have given last year. Which is a good sign, right? There is some change. I keep changing my mind. I hope that I am improving as I go along, but at least I know that there is some differences in the way that I have been conceiving and thinking of the project and the work. Now that the book is out and having been listening to various comments and reactions to it. The process of writing the book itself, as it were, the book is called What is an American Muslim? Question mark, really. Embracing faith and citizenship. And just to cut to the short, what is an American Muslim? An American Muslim is an American who happens to be a Muslim. There is no mystery to it. Just like an American can be anything else, and even the American Muslim can be anything else. An American Muslim is one who is a Muslim, but many other things as well. And that is, I think, actually the core of the message, or the point I was going to make through the book, by trying to emphasize that we have multiple identities, that we tend to negotiate our identities in different situations, some strategically, some tactically, and that we tend to sometimes over or under-emphasize certain aspects of our identities, and this is something that we all do. We do it so spontaneously that we are not even aware of the fact that we are doing it most of the time. I'm sure that even as we come here, we have been doing some of that already in the way. So, but the point, I think, as I started thinking about it and trying to develop the book into a thesis, a broader thesis, it's about what I think is important to make as a general point, which is to move away from the politics of minority-majority notions. That there is no stable majority, no stable minority, anywhere for anything. Each single one of us in this room is a member of minorities in some respects and of majorities in other respects. There is no permanent majority. There is no person who is a majority in every way, in every respect, everywhere. No, it doesn't happen that way. So therefore, I think the point to take is to say that since none of us is a permanent minority or majority, we should not think in those terms. And we should not deal or be dealt with in those terms. That we should not perceive others as members of minorities or self as members. If we act as a minority, we become a minority in the very negative sense of being persecuted, being marginalized, being discriminated against, and so on. Now, what is new, I thought, you know that dramatic moment in movies, I mean, when someone is winning, you know, in playing some sort of game, and then at some point he or she would push everything to the middle and say, I'm betting everything. So this is the push I'm making. The push is to say that I would like to make this claim broader, not only about American Muslims, but about all situations, all groups of people in every way that they tend to identify. That is, I would like to argue through this presentation that the idea might be useful to have as a main and constant feature of analysis, of understanding human situations and human struggles for social justice, for individual freedom, and so on. That it is not just simply a question of trying to accommodate a religious minority that's awkwardly on the shore in this country or this part of the world, but we are trying to say that this is in fact a situation that we all have everywhere, and we might as well try to accept and work with that in more longer term, and therefore try to develop. And when I said I'm pushing everything to the middle of the table, I'm saying that I would like to get your critique. You shoot it down, tell me that I better back off and try something else. That's fine. Or to say that if there is something here that is worth exploring. Now, let me briefly go over the original thesis as I presented it before in the book and so on. That the point is to say that the only identity all Americans share is citizenship. In everything else, Americans are different, are diverse, are pluralistic, whatever term that you choose to use. Meaning that there is nothing that unites all Americans except their citizenship. And therefore the question will become, if that is the case, what is the content of that citizenship for it to be a universal identity for all Americans? Universal, I mean, in this part of the world. Rather than just simply a political status. But how does it, or can it be, an identity in a meaningful sense? And if it is, what does that imply, or what does that entail? And also that what does it entail for other types of identities that Americans tend to have? That seemed to be the question that I tried to lay out in the first chapter of the book. And from that, as I said already, I'm trying to emphasize the need to move away from minority-majority politics. By minority-majority politics, which I think maybe by trying to explain it in this way, we can see how it can have broader implications, is that to think of political positions in terms of identity markers. That I'm taking this position because I am black, or because I am Muslim, or because I am gay, or because I am a female. And I would like to suggest that that is rather unfortunate, and we tend to do it, but I think it is reductionist and essentializing and not very productive. That, in fact, the positions we should take not despite or against or contrary to, but simply independent of whatever identities we seem to have. Meaning that the more positions are driven by broader ethical, normative, political reasons, the better, I think. And the less they are driven by narrow view of identities and self-perception and perception by the other, the more problematic it becomes. So that is the move that I'm trying to develop here. In a chapter, in the book, chapter 2, I try to go over the notion of negotiating citizenship of the United States. And again, we tend to think of, as you can tell from my accent, already I think Chantal said it, I'm from Sudan, and I grew up really with a very, very negative view of the United States. People in my part of the world really thought of the United States only in terms of its foreign policy. And it was the most stupid, reckless, irresponsible, chauvinistic foreign policy you can imagine. And that's what we saw. It filled the horizon for us. That is the only thing that we could see or understand about the United States was really its miserable foreign policy, which is still continues to be, by the way, as of today, as we speak. Nothing has changed on that front. But which is maybe one of the points I will try to highlight towards the end. But the point is that to say that having come to this country and having lived in this country, I have come to realize and to understand and to appreciate aspects of the United States that I know by my own experience, people from my part of the world do not yet know or have seen. And therefore, I know how it could be difficult psychologically, emotionally, for someone to identify as a citizen of the United States. We come over, we take, we benefit from the experiences, from the opportunities that we have, and we eventually get residency, and we get citizenship, and we swear allegiance to the flag, to the Constitution, actually. It's very important, to the Constitution of the United States, not to the flag of the United States, and not to the government of the United States, not even to the state of the United States. It is to the Constitution of the United States, which is a very powerful normative, I think, instrument that we should all respect. And as we know, we get to know it more, we respect it more. So we go through these motions, but still I think for myself, the psychological barrier to acknowledging myself as a citizen of the United States was still something that I had to struggle with. And that it is something that I came to accept and to appreciate over time. And for that reason, I realized the difficulty that others may have with the same type of experience of transforming ourselves from naturalized citizens into just citizens. And not in terms of citizenship as a political status, but citizenship as a sense of identity, of something that is I identify with. And I think it is important to understand the struggles that people have. And that struggle is not peculiar to Muslims, it's not peculiar to Africans, it's not peculiar to every people who have come to these shores have been through the same struggle, or very similar struggles. And therefore that Jewish communities, Mormons, every type of community that came over and at some point, whether ethnically or racially, or the process of becoming American, whether it's Irish or Italian or Japanese or Korean, all of these communities have been experiencing something similar. So therefore the point is that citizenship For one thing, the citizenship into which people have come to identify is not a given. It's a product of a political struggle. It's a product of social and economic transformations. It was a product of an outcome of a process that is not over yet, and that it will continue to evolve. But also, in all fairness, and honestly, I think that when you compare the citizenship of the United States to citizenship of other parts of the world, including the parts from which some of us have come, the comparison is really very miserable in terms of what citizenship is perceived to be and how citizens are treated in other countries. So it is to acknowledge here that there is a value to the citizenship of the United States, knowing its history, knowing how long it took to get to where it is now, and all the difficulties it still has to overcome. I think that it has to be acknowledged also that it is something that is valuable and important, and a human achievement. I think we tend to, again, overlook the historical human dimension of experiences of communities like the United States. There are things now that we take for granted, which were not that self-evident. They were not even self-evident to the people who claimed that they were self-evident. And they struggled for a long time to come to terms with what that meant, and so did many others, and now we benefit from those struggles in trying to understand and to appreciate those values: constitutionalism, federalism, fundamental rights, the institutions of political accountability, of transparency. And despite all that we can say, and we can and must say, there is really a significant advance in global human experience out of experiences of peoples who live and struggle in this part of the world. One of those, I think, is the question of legal dimensions of religious self-determination, what I call, which is that an aspect of American constitutionalism that is really a contribution to human civilization at large is the manner in which the Constitution and subsequently the various amendments that came along the years, and the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, and the struggles of civil liberties organizations, and all of that has given us by this I mean humanity at large, such a wealth of insights, experiences, and struggles that we should cherish and benefit from and draw upon. So I think that the critical point for us to realize at this point is that the critical question of the relationship between religion, the state, and politics is an extremely complex and protracted type of issue that can never be resolved categorically as a matter of a formula that you can prescribe. It can only be mediated through practice. And that the process by which the various amendments, for example, have come to really, when you follow the jurisprudence of the various amendments through the years, and through the decades and centuries, you will appreciate also the need for it to play out. It couldn't have made it otherwise, that it had to be a process of trial and error, of fits and starts, of setbacks, and so on, that, like all other human experiences, it had to take its course in that way. And having taken its course, it has given us something to work with going forward from here. One point that I tend to emphasize, because I think it is not quite appreciated even in sort of highly intellectual and accomplished campuses like this one, is that the assumption that the US Constitution separates between religion and the state is assumed to be a separation between religion and politics. And I think that's a fallacy. The United States Constitution does not distinguish between religion and politics. And the American experience at large, jurisprudentially, constitutionally, politically, in every other way, has not made that distinction. And that, to the extent that we fail to appreciate the interconnectedness of religion and politics were undermining the separation of religion and the state. The argument I'm making is that we need to understand that religion and politics remain connected in order to be able to negotiate the separateness of religion and the state. And for that, I think, again, we have to draw on experiences of other countries, like India, for example, and Scandinavian countries, and others who have struggled with similar issues on their terms as well. The question also that I deal with, which is a bit delicate, I think, for American Muslims, because I'm an African Muslim, at this point an African American Muslim, but not in the sense of an African American Muslim, as I think some of our colleagues will, Herman Jackson, I think, will make it African American, like is that that we don't appreciate the internal tensions that are ethnic, racial, gender-based, and in other ways, very human, all of it, but should not be glossed over between different communities of American Muslims. And that there are assumed hierarchies of leadership that have to be challenged. That there are even assumed qualities of leadership or criteria of leadership that have to be redefined fundamentally. And those will raise profound theological questions. For example, as to the question of the role of the Arabic language in relation to Islam. To what extent can Muslims continue to worship in translation or lack of translation, because the belief is that the Quran cannot be translated. And what does that mean for the quality of the religious experience? But also what it means for the possibilities of contesting religious leadership when you are not a native Arabic speaker, or when you have to qualify into leadership by criteria that are alien to who you are, whether ethnically or culturally or in other ways. So those are the tensions that we have to confront and acknowledge as American Muslim communities and to come to terms with them. And the point here, I think, that we should understand is that, well, of course, my position may be a little bit radical, but I don't believe that there is such a thing as a unity, of course, of political leadership and religious leadership. Religion and politics cannot be separated, I think, categorically, but there are different types of qualities of leadership, and that we should seek secular political leadership for our communities wherever we can find the best leadership there is, and to follow and to hold that leadership accountable and to pursue cultivation and development of that leadership without assuming that it has to somehow collapse into an Islamic religious leadership. And the whole question of how leadership is conferred on people and how it is acquired by people or claimed by people is one of the conversations that Muslims are still to have. That we have not really spoken candidly about those issues among our own communities, and that we need to. The one point I would say here briefly is to say that religious leadership is in the eyes of the beholder, meaning that it is only I who confer on you whatever leadership you may or may not have. You cannot claim it on me except to the extent that I am conceding it to you. That is the nature of it, although most of us are not really fully conscious of that quality of leadership or that feature of leadership. And therefore we tend to assume leadership as associated with certain particular features. Sometimes, like if you have that tafna of, the little dark spot here, which means that when you kneel to pray, you press your forehead strongly and rub it so that you have a mark here. It shows that you pray heavily, or the rounded beard and the white robes. All these sort of cinematic qualities of presumed religious leadership are fallacies that we have come to cultivate which permit really very shallow, ineffective, and uninsightful leadership to prevail, and as such have led our communities into serious problems and difficulties. There are many social and economic and political issues that our communities have to negotiate and to have to come to terms with, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of membership of mosques, and even prayers at mosques. I mean, I came to situations which were really very shocking to me when I see, for example, not only in terms of, I'm sure many of you are aware of the fact that women are taken to a corner in the mosque, upstairs, downstairs, or some cellar where they pray out of sight and are not supposed to be part of the same congregation of people who pray. But at the same time, you can imagine having to force communities into a situation where men and women have to pray together, as they do in Mecca, by the way, when they go to the pilgrimage. Men and women make pilgrimage together in total mixing. There is no lines for men and lines for women. But in our mosques, that's what they do. And often we see very strange situations where people a man and a woman would come out of the same bus, and when they get to the mosque, he will go into one door and she will go into another door. And then they meet up again after the prayer and go together in the same bus back to the same job in which they are both working with other men and women. So there are very, very obvious contradictions and tensions that we have to consider and to deal with. But still, my point is not to dismiss community as irrelevant, or to say that we can do without, or to say that we can just simply jump into a situation where we resolve tensions about gender roles, about sexuality, about social and economic relations in the family and community. What do you say to a Muslim woman who comes up to you and say that I'm divorced through a civil procedure, but I still believe myself to be married because I was married to this man through a nikah, through a Muslim marriage. And she feels married, although she is legally not married. And she will remain married for her life and will never be able to take a second husband or another husband, although the man may, in fact, already have one or two already to deal with. So the point is, there are tensions that go deep into the sociology and psychology and theology of Muslim experiences and history that we have to tackle and so on. And all of that, I think, will open up if we shed the defensiveness of being a minority. The entrenchment, the conservative entrenchment of minorities under siege. And the only entity or person who can do that is ourselves, for ourselves. Nobody else can do it for us. Sometimes I don't want to make light of a point, but it's like sort of exercise. It's like, regime system. Nobody can do it for you. You have to do it for yourself. No, you cannot benefit from it except when you do it for yourself, by yourself. So I think that there are many issues that we have to tackle and deal with, that we can begin to deal with those questions when we begin to realize that we are, even in terms of being a minority that assumes that we are a religious, monolithic, autonomous, stable entity that's called the Muslim community of here or there, or even if you take it by town. I mean, I live in Atlanta, and I'm sure in Atlanta there are multiple Muslim communities in the plural, not a single Muslim community. And when you go to mosques, you will see that mosques are divided by ethnic affiliations. South Asians tend to go to different mosques from Middle Easterners, and Sub-Saharan Africans go to other mosques, and so on. It's not as if you find them all sharing the same mosque and so on. We have to understand and to appreciate the role of the state in regulating religious experience, which is one of the aspects I was referring to in terms of the contribution of American jurisprudential experience, in that we have now ways of trying to sort of unpack very complex questions about institutional autonomy, about religious integrity, and about gender justice, for example, or non-discrimination in the question of employment, questions of membership of religious organizations, and so on. Those are issues and things that in which we can benefit and draw upon the experiences of other communities. There is the question I think that we have to tackle, I think also, which is the question of the relationship between Sharia and the state, or Sharia and state law. I'm sure that you're aware of the very silly experiences that we have heard about around the country of some places passing constitutional amendment or statute banning Sharia. You can't ban Sharia. It is not something that you can ban. Because what is it? Where is it? Where can you find it so that you can ban it? And what do you do to ban it? It's really obviously things which people have not thought through. But they do reflect a profound suspicion and fear of something called Sharia, which is out there, which is here to get us, which is about to take over our freedoms, and we are going to destroy our liberties and so on. That is silly, but it is a very understandable silliness that we have to deal with. And the question is that because this sort of confusion is in the hearts of minds of Muslims as much as it is in the hearts of minds of others. The woman that I mentioned, what we call linking marriage, the woman who will be divorced legally but feels married and remains married and unable to to go into a second marriage in her life out of a sense of commitment, or a woman who would relinquish custody over her children because she feels that is the way it should be, that men should have custody of children, or that the question of the inheritance rights, all sorts of issues in which, so when we say that Sharia may continue to be practiced in communities, there are going to be difficult questions of what do we do when we perceive practices of Sharia in communities which are discriminatory against women, which are unfair to or for children, unsafe for children. When custody is given to a man who is incapable of exercising responsible parentship to a child, because that is the assumption that Sharia expects us to do or requires us to do. So there are those questions that we can neither intervene legally nor can we stand by sort of socially and politically and just look at this and see it happen. So that we have to come to terms with how does the law and how does Sharia relate to constitutional issues, to political and social issues at large. So all of those are, and I should maybe come to the second part of my presentation, is to say that those are issues that we can begin to tackle when we overcome this notion of being a minority or being an identifiable, stable minority in any way. Because we are many things and our being religiously, who knows? I mean, in the Muslim community, probably I'm a minority of one. Not many people think the way I do, but at least I do self-identify as a Muslim. Now, do we take self-identification as the exclusive and conclusive marker of Muslim identity? Or are we going to open the gate to say, no, we have to examine whether I'm a real Muslim or not just simply because I claim to be a Muslim. So when I self-identify as a Muslim, is that good enough? And if it is not, who's going to decide what is good enough and who's going to apply it? And those are the type of questions that I was hinting at and referring to. But let me now try to step back and say that, to me, as I tried to develop in the last chapter, and again, as I said, in this campus in particular, I draw on the notion of imagined communities to say that a critical move that we need to have is to reimagine our communities. And to reimagine our communities along different value systems, along different social structures and relationships, that to the extent that, and I think to a large extent that it is in our minds, that what it means to be a Muslim and how we relate to each other as Muslims is something that we imagine to begin with. It is not necessarily the way it is, but it is the way we imagine it to be. I think that is true, and that's one of the insights that Benedict Anderson has made, I think. But the point is that he was making it in relation to nationalism, and I would like to make it to challenge nationalism. One of my subversive maybe objectives is to undermine totally the project of nationalism. I think it has exhausted and sort of served its purpose, if it had any purpose to begin with, and that you have to think of something else. And I will come to that and why this move, I think I'm trying to make here with your help, or approval or lack of it, will take us in that direction. The point is that when I say that we need to reimagine, I may be conceiving of the process of reimagining too mechanically and too simplistically. Because reimagining actually is not an arbitrary sort of process that I can will it to happen, or just simply sit and close my eyes and maybe close my tears and say, yes, I want to reimagine my community. It's not. It has to draw on my experience. It has to draw on my also the limits and the boundaries and sources of my own imagination. I don't think that we can truly imagine, and I hope that maybe, or at least there's a chance I might be challenged on this. I don't think that we can really think of imagining as of something that we have no experience of. I think we can imagine only something that we know, or something that we think we know, or in some partial way do know. I don't think that we can imagine something of which we have no knowledge whatsoever. Tell me, I would like to hear from you on that. So if that is the case, then as the resources and the possibilities of our, the reimaginative resources and possibilities expand, as the spatial and historical and contextual dimensions of what we draw reimagination from expand, the possibilities of reimagination will grow. So that if nations are imagined communities, by imagining or by knowing or experiencing a global humanity that can now stand in solidarity over crucial social justice issues across the globe, that can stand in protest against violence, against trafficking, in human trafficking, or against child soldiers and other types of horrendous atrocities. That possibility creates new ways of imagining and reimagining ourselves and our communities. That we are no longer limited by the possibilities of imagining a nation into the possibilities of imagining a global human experience that brings us all at a human level. Although it may not overtake our national imaginaries immediately and completely overnight, but that progressively, I think, but the point is that there is a tension that we have to let go of one to get to the other. That we have to overcome the impulse, which is a tribal impulse, of national imaginaries in order to come to humane and human, globally inclusive humane and human imaginaries. That really to take suffering seriously across the globe, not caring for only people who are like us, who look like us, or maybe speak on our accent, or maybe share our belief, or share our whatever feature that we think are markers of our identity, so that we care as much for something that happens across the world in the Philippines as we care for something that happens next door to our own hometown or the town next door. That is what I meant by expanding the resources and experiences from which we can draw imaginaries. The possibilities of social solidarity, possibilities of human rights and ethical commitments that can bring us together, and so on. And for that, what I meant by saying that there is a tension between, so we have to give up on one to get to the other. That is, we have to be willing to commit heresies against our creed. And here I use creed sort of advisedly, not only religion, but all types of creed. We have to be willing to engage in heresy against our creeds in order to gain possibilities of more expansive and inclusive humanity for all human beings or whatever creed or religion and so on. We have to be willing to commit treason against our own states, our own political identities and political and national identities, in order to be able to be committed and to be devoted to a more inclusive global structure of power sharing, of accountability, of transparency that can replace and displace the so-called nation state in due course, and I hope very soon. So that is the thing about that. The imagining cannot be in impersonal, abstract ways, but it has to be in personally felt and personally threatening ways. My claim is that if I'm just simply engaged in an academic exercise of imagining and reimagining what this or the other might be, without personally feeling a stake in the outcome, I don't think that will make much difference. That in the book I come to discuss at some point something called virtual communities, the idea that we can have, internet-based virtual communities of people who can debate questions and express opinions and engage in solidarities and all sorts of things. But I think the point that I make in that, which again relying on the people who wrote about this, is that those types of communities are not really meaningful, are not really what we mean by community. Because they are not based on lived experience, they are not based on shared risks of political choices that people make. Just before we started this lecture, Salah was telling me about demonstrations in Khartoum now, where students have been out on the streets, and a student was killed, and the University of Khartoum, our former university, is now at the cost of a political sort of once more political uprising that we have had so many of that, so almost one cannot even keep count. I mean, we have so many springs. We never have a spring in Sudan, but if Arab Springs are, those types of outbursts of protests and street protests and so on, we have had many of them, and yet we don't seem to have really covered enough ground to be able to make political achievement out of these types of outbursts. But the students suffer and pay the price. That is the point I mean, that we have to make choices and take risks for which we are personally accountable. For that to be transformative of our communities. And the we here is not only we who happen to be in sort of any parts of the world that whether it is Thailand or the Ukraine or Congo. It is here as in this campus, here as in this room. Which is the final point I'm making, is to say that here it is, everything seems so far-fetched. We are not really at risk. We can talk about these things because we are here. We can freely speculate about, ridicule the president because we are here. We can ridicule Congress because we are here. But in fact, I think there is a level of with all due respect, self-deception and really failing to grasp what is the point. If we want, us in this room, we in this type of environment, if we want to make a difference, we should undermine and we should challenge and we should commit our heresies and our treasons where it matters, how it matters, not in ways that we know are not going to matter. By that I mean, being very explicit here, that there are powers in this country which if you challenge, you will pay the price for. And until we challenge those powers, and until we challenge those structures, and until we undermine those relationships, we are not making the difference in our communities that is transformative of those communities. That my point again and I'm sure that I don't need to belabor it, but so that at least I have done what I can to clarify. I know it, I'm not saying it's right. That the point is that we tend to, I don't want to sound conspiratorial or exaggerating in this, but the point is that we are permitted a space where we can say what we want to say, we can do what we want to do, we can construct our experiments, and we can conduct our conferences and do our conversations, but we are not really threatening the real structures of power. We are not really threatening the structures of wealth and distribution of wealth. And with that, we can enjoy the illusion that we are free to do as we please. But if we really want to be free to do as we please, we need to do what it takes to challenge those powers enough for us not to be secure and safe. And there is a point where that for sure we will encounter that if we are willing to, as I say, to commit treason against our states, not in the abstract, not as theoretical proposition, but as an actual concrete experience and example, that creates the threat of retaliation, the threat of self-vulnerability, or a sense of vulnerability, then I think we will be in a position to challenge. So to bring it back to talking about Muslims reimagining, that as a Muslim, as an American Muslim, as a Muslim globally speaking also, I need to take positions that are challenging to structures of authority and power and self-assurance within my community so that I feel threatened. It's only to the extent that I feel threatened because I have overstepped the mark. The very fact that there is a mark not to be overstepped, and I overstep it, is exactly the point. And when we do that in whatever our communities are, regarding whatever issues, talk about university structures, university administrations, university funding. There are things which, if we do, we upset our funders. And if we upset our funders, we interrupt funding sources coming to our community of distinction and excellence here. And so on. So those are the types of thought I thought I would put, and I thought that I would be pushing whatever the beginning of this conversation I have had last year to try to see how far I can take it. Thank you very much.
So we have several minutes for questions. I invite the audience to ask questions.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. It was wonderful. Something I was wondering if you could address, I very much appreciate your emphasis on subversive activity. I thought that was really interesting. However, it seemed like the paradigm that you're constructing with that sort of oscillates between inclusivity and exclusivity. For example, you started the talk off talking about citizenship, something that would maybe link all Americans. However, the example you gave for citizenship was also sort of a very exclusive notion of citizenship that doesn't take into account perhaps the presence of other people in this country, for example, are undocumented. So I was wondering if you could address that it seems that in a way you're sort of reinscribing or codifying an exclusivity while at the same time arguing for a more inclusive space to realize this subversivity.
Yes, you are right, but I think because the way to that is through this, that you have to respect the political structures and principles of self-determination and self-governance, democratic self-governance, that we have got to have come to have in order to be able to take it to the next step where we can open up to other possibilities. That is, that one point about exclusivity and inclusivity is to think of overlapping identities as ways in which sort of the reason I like the poster or the poster that was made for this talk, I was very struck by it because the artists who designed it managed to overlay different ideas of what's an American Muslim in ways that was not inclusive or exclusive completely, that I identified with some of the images and references in that design, and I was totally alienated by others. But to many, or maybe to most, all of them are what an American Muslim is. There was an image of Malcolm X, and an image of Sheikh Umar Abdurrahman, the cleric who tried to blow up the World Trade Center in '93. And there was sort of the American flag, and there was also Arabic calligraphy, which refers to the Quran. I think I was conflicted about the multiple images that I could see. And that's exactly the point that the artist managed to convey in the conversation that I'm trying to advance here. That it should be something that we don't feel quite comfortable with. That there's something missing, but also there's something that we have to acknowledge. So the question of undocumented immigrants. I don't think that one can responsibly say that we don't care that we have as many undocumented immigrants as having to be able to come into this country. Because we are not getting the most deserving or the most sort of worthy of help or attention. We are getting those who are able to get here. And that in itself may be arbitrary and unfair in its own ways. So it is not, I don't think that the immigration crisis or issue can be resolved by just simply opening the door completely so that anybody can come anytime. After all, there are responsibilities that people who live here have fulfilled, for which they are entitled to some services, taxes and sort of allegiance and obeying of the law. So the question is not that morally or ethically or philosophically simple. And therefore, it is not to say that here and now we immediately resolve the problem of inclusivity and exclusivity. But it is to say that we should engage in types of conversations that will enable us over time to mediate tensions between inclusivity and exclusivity. And again, every identity that we care to mention, it has to have an exclusive part to be meaningful. But the question is how to have that exclusive part without excluding what is shared among other human beings, among the same members of the group. For example, I mean that there is actually in 2 weeks there is a conference at Yale about religious heterodoxy and Islam or something. The point is about how do we deal with the religiously heterodox. Is the word right? Heterodox. The thing is that whatever community you choose, it will have to identify in terms that are not totally inclusive of everybody, or else it will cease to have meaning, but not exclusive in a way that is diminishing of the humanity of the other. That's why it's a paradox, it's a problem. And I think that sort of for example, the Ahmadis who are persecuted in Pakistan, who are really suffering, constitutionally defined as non-Muslim, although they self-identify as Muslims. It's a crime to call themselves their mosque a mosque. It's a crime to call to the prayer, for them to call to the prayer. Although they self-identify as Muslim, they are constitutionally and legally defined as non-Muslims. Even they would define themselves in terms that will exclude some and include others. They are not going to say everybody is an Ahmadi. They will say an Ahmadi is someone who believes in this and does that. So the fact that we are victims of inclusion and exclusion does not really qualify us to be totally inclusive. I don't know if that makes sense.
Sure, if I have one, I can jump in. Oh, Marianne, yes.
Hi, thanks for your lecture. So I have two questions. The first one was in relation to the first part of your presentation, which I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you build on the assumption that viewing like the word minority is necessarily negative. And I don't know if that's something I don't know if that's something you struggled with in terms of defining, because a lot of times, you know, just terming yourself a minority can be a source of empowerment for a group, especially, you know, and some maybe even necessary for the survival of Muslim Americans as a perceived group. And I guess my second question goes to when you started talking about Anderson's theory, and I mean, this is a question for you. How do you imagine, practically speaking, that an everyday experience is part of a reimagining of a community? Because you yourself mentioned that American Muslims are not one and the same, and you can have American Muslims from different cultures and that with different backgrounds and speak different languages. And so is it I mean, just thinking of American Muslims as one group is sort of an imagination beyond perceived experience. If I, as a Muslim from America, consider myself as part of the same group as someone with whom I have nothing in common but this adopted identity, isn't that not including my personal experience at all?
No, it is, but in different ways. I'm saying that both of them, I am capable of imagining them because I have experience of them. But the point I was trying to make at that point is to say that, I will start with this point and then come back to the other one. The point I was trying to make is to say that it is not really quite possible. It is that imagining and reimagining are not totally arbitrary and open-ended exercises. They are parameters of experience and knowledge that permit imaginability. So I can't imagine how life is on Mars because I have absolutely no knowledge of it. No, it's maybe just a glimpse of, you know, what people told me here and there, which is really doesn't really give me a sufficiently sort of comprehensive picture to be able to imagine what life is like on Mars or you know, or even in some other Australia, which is close to Mars. So what I'm saying is that there is sort of the need for some familiarity that enables me to conceive of what I'm trying to imagine. So although all American Muslims may tend to vaguely imagine themselves as one community, but in fact they are very different, and they are so different that some of them would not acknowledge others as Muslims at all. And yet there is this gloss of saying we are all Muslims. But when it comes to really thinking concretely, they are not really quite the same Muslims. Like where I live in Atlanta, there is a place called Clarkston, which is not far from where I live, where it's almost exclusively Somalis. I mean, three huge, or rather huge Somali communities, and they are divided into three mosques. That none of them will ever be caught dead in the other mosque. There are people, they speak the same language, they are of the same ethnicity, they share the same religion, but yet, and they all identify as Muslims, but they would not be sort of in the same room with the others, because they don't believe the others to be Muslims at all. So that type of experience is to show that we are really, when we talk about a minority, we are extremely generalizing and trivializing the entity we are talking about. And the question, that was a colonial idea. The idea that there is something called minorities which need protection against majorities was a colonial idea that was thrust on in various regions in India, in the Ottoman Empire, to create situations where European powers can intervene to protect minorities. And we see the fruits of, you know, as we speak in the Ukraine and the Crimea. I mean, where all these regions came from? How did the Crimea get to be Russian majority? What was Stalin's role in that? And so there are sort of certain experiences in history that show that whatever empowerment minority status may give, in fact, is less than fully democratic, inclusive membership of the whole community. So if you identify as a minority, you are a permanent minority. Whereas if you say, there are some respects in which I am a minority, but some respects in which I am member of other communities. Like the example I give is about myself. I'm an African, I'm an American, I'm a Muslim, but I'm also of this political party, also of that professional training and association. So with each of these, I identify with others who have very little or nothing to do with my other identities. So there are many Muslims in this country I would not in the least have anything in common with in terms of social positions or political positions or you know, in terms of the values that we experience, in terms of the lives that we live. So why should, you know, give a blunt example that everybody can take. Why should I identify with a Wahhabi American Muslim where I have absolutely nothing in common with his worldview, with his lifestyle, with his moral choices or ethical choices and so on? So because we both identify as Muslims, from the very beginning Muslims identify with something called the Ummah. Of course, I mean, we all hear about this, all the Ummah, this Ummah, that. There was never an Ummah, not for a single day. That it was a myth all along, but it was a myth that was kept alive because people needed a myth of that nature to keep alive so that they can somehow have a rallying point. But that rallying point was every time about an identity of that ummah that other members of the ummah would not accept. That's why we never had it in terms of material political conditions and situations. I don't know if that responds to your point. There was one.
I'm glad you mentioned the Ummah because my question was going to be is that one notion or concept that actually seemed to unify Islamists as a political movement and Islamicists as scholars. They always imagine the notion of the Ummah. And they tend to make it as something that distinguishes Islam from you mentioned something, but I want you to elaborate more.
The religious community.
Oh, okay.
The religious community.
The Ummah term, the Ummah refers to a global Muslim community, right?
That will be definitely. But then there is also a notion of belonging. There is also a loyalty to it that can transcend nation states and all of those things. That's something that the Islamists propagate as a major for the propaganda of Islamic solidarity in general. But then on the other side, there is also the Islamicists and scholars also sometimes emphasize this as and become their business, is that it's really to propagate this notion that that's what distinguishes Islam, even though Islam doesn't have the same hierarchy like in Christianity and Vatican and so forth. It's not a top-down religion, but then they emphasize that in the absence of the other as something that distinguishes Islam, even though it doesn't have. So you may want to say more because you mentioned it and I'd like to hear more. But the other question that I have is about with the way you talk is like at the end, and this is just a rhetorical question, provocative. Why do we care about an American Muslim or defining an American Muslim? You know, just listening to you, just this question came to me. And it provoked me to ask, okay, so what is an American Muslim after all what you said?
Yeah. An American Muslim is an American citizen who self-identifies as a Muslim. If the question is immaterial to you, then you are not an American Muslim. By this I mean that the question is important for those to whom the question is meaningful. But if the question is not, to me it is meaningful. And to me that's why I care to try to identify and to try to analyze and to understand it. Because I do self-identify as an American Muslim, meaning an American citizen who happen to be of a Muslim as a matter of religion. But there are many American Muslims who do not care for the question, for the American part or the Muslim part. And to them, the question is irrelevant, and that's fine. But there will be other questions which would be relevant to those people. That's why I try to broaden the theory beyond the question of American Muslim into a broader concern about how we identify as of any sort of creed, even if our creed happens to be scientific experimentalism or empiricism. If that's our creed, then we have to be prepared to commit heresy for that creed, for us to experience the feeling of being threatened by retaliation that will make our heresy meaningful. But if we are theoretical empiricists or social scientist empiricists, whatever you call it, and we don't care enough for that we can't commit heresy too, then it is not our creed. And therefore we are not reimagining the creed of that community by challenging a quality that we don't really take seriously. I don't know if that is coherent, but maybe you can continue this conversation. But let me move on to the first question, which was
On the Ummah.
Oh, the Ummah. Of course, I mean that by the way, the so-called Orientalism, I mean, here is, you know, the whole post-colonial discourse about the role of scholarship in legitimizing and sort of spearheading colonialism, and that by constructing sort of the role of Islamicists, by those who mean those who study Islam, is to give academic credence to the othering of the Muslim. So that there is, you know, I know in this company I should be sensitive to, I don't mean to offend, but I do believe it to be the case that there is an academic sort of creed, you might say, or trend. You know, for example, the other day I was listening to a lecture by a scholar from Chicago who was speaking about the role of military intelligence in the construction of the othering of the north-west frontier, which is present-day Afghanistan, in relation to the Indian, to British India, so-called, and how the cross currents of military intelligence and anthropology and history and political science are totally indistinguishable. The same people are recycled. The same scholars would be sort of intelligence officers. They will come into the diplomatic service of the British Foreign Office or India office, and then they will come into academia, go to Cambridge, also write a couple of books, and come out again and be in the political service. So, I mean, he really followed the trends and documented from British sources how there is such an overlap and intermingling of these threads. What are the origins and roots of anthropology, of history, of political economy, all these fields? Do we say that this was colonial and this was sort of Christian? No, they were the same people anyway. So unless you can talk about the many hats of the Orientalists. But the point, I think, is to say that the fact that there is a consciousness of something about, you said about Muslim unity, about sympathy and so on. The Indian partition, or the partition of India, how many million people were killed to establish East Pakistan and West Pakistan as unified Pakistan? How many people were killed in East Pakistan to keep it part of Pakistan? Talk about solidarity and global Ummah unity. 2 million Bengalis were killed. The hundreds of thousands of Muslim Bengali women who were raped by the Pakistani army in East Pakistan. For East Pakistan to become liberated from West Pakistan by the intervention of India in 1971. So, I mean, what more ummah would you like than to have a people who broke away from mainland India to establish East and West Pakistan at the cost of millions of lives, only to engage 20 years later in the massive slaughter of each other? It was primarily actually of one side over the other, in order to force one unit to remain and for the other unit to be able to break away. So I think that the exaggerated talk about Ummah, what does the Ummah and Ummah unity mean when in Karachi people walk into mosques with submachine guns? Mosques, submachine guns. Talk about Ummah unity, they come and submachine gun killing sort of all the people who are praying, or any people, a number of the people they can, because they are Shia and we are Sunnis, or because they are whatever and we are the other. So it is a totally romanticized, exaggerated myth that has to be confronted and challenged, so that we say that, look, I mean that the only category that I care for is the human. I think every other category is dispensable. We can do without. But the human is, we just happen to be, until to the end of this world, there is one coming. But we are all human. Otherwise, everything else is negotiable. But to have a sense of identity for which you kill, you know, for which Americans go to kill Iraqis, or Iranians come to kill Iraqis, or Iraqis go to kill Americans. What about Syria? What Ummah do you mean? I mean, for the last 26 months, Syrians have been killing other Syrians. And Assad is supported by Christians against Muslims, and Muslims are killing each other. And so who is who? Who's killing whom? You can't even tell. And this is in a tiny territory that we call Syria. So I think that is something that we really need to dispel completely, and to say that, look, we have to build on commonalities and vulnerabilities which are global to us as human beings, because our realities are now global. That what is local is global, and what is local is global, in the sense that it is immediate. We know and we care and we are affected by what goes on anywhere else. Sorry, too long. You had your hand up, but you want to say it? Yeah, you also.
Yeah, I very much appreciate and like your humanist sort of argument, but and then relating that to your earlier premise about you can't really, in an arbitrary fashion, imagine a community. It has to be through experience. Then I think, well, how do we imagine a human? Right? Because everybody is coming to it from very different grounded experiences. So I mean, this has been what people have been wrestling for centuries. Correct. Right? And what's human is also being defined very culturally and historically, specifically. Think about the Enlightenment, I mean, all that stuff. We don't even need to go there. But yeah, I just interested to know how you reconcile those two aspects of your I mean,
because it is just simply not exclusive, meaning that difference is human. So the quality of being human includes the quality of seeking to be different, or seeking to identify. But it's a difference we can understand. It's a difference we can comprehend. That's why we can imagine. So, meaning that because there is a shared humanity, we are able to imagine even those aspects of which we are. For example, I'm a male, I happen to be a male, you happen to be a female. But I have an imagining of what it means to be woman, because I experienced that in my families, with my wife, with my daughter, with my children, and so on. And so did you. So it is not to be, but to be able to imagine. And so we are all human, but also in that quality of being human, we are different. And the impulse to be different is integral to the impulse to be human. It is integral to being human is being different. So that I often cite him on this, Albie Sachs, the South African jurist, who says that human rights are about the right to be the same and the right to be different. So when I want my human rights to be respected, I don't want them to be respected as you, but as me. So my human rights are what my rights are to me, and your human rights are what your human rights are to you. But we can both have an understanding of what that means to each other, that we can empathize and we can stand in solidarity in trying to protect that your ability to achieve your right and my ability to achieve mine are interdependent. Although they are different, because your experience of what it is to be human is different from mine, but which is in itself is the genius of the human. But at least it is, when I said experience and resource, I didn't mean to be identical, but I meant to be sufficient familiarity to enable us to imagine.
Sorry. No, I just honestly, he was talking about, please challenge me earlier, so I was
okay.
going to go into that direction a little bit.
Okay.
If you don't mind, unless you have a question. No, it's really just about, you started, sorry, you started earlier, I mean, you talked about, understandably, that how people perceive the US from outside, and you went into, and so that all is good, but then, in your answer about the Ummah, it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, you're more protesting the lack of solidarity when Muslims get killed by other Muslims to destroy or to debunk the notion of the Ummah. But I think in the process, you make those conflicts as if they're very mystical and inexplicable. Because when you say to me, okay, people are killing people in Syria and nobody knows why, I think it makes it as if it is not a conflict with some roots, historical, that are actually man-made, because that's what men do anyway. I'm just putting it literally here. That's man-made problem, like subject to man-made, human-made solutions. So you run the risk in that, because you start with really giving very good depth and historical understanding of how you came up with it. But then in your criticism, I just felt there was a risk there.
Okay.
To tell you, okay, the possibility of me identifying with Islam, even though I perceive myself as secular, or, that I agree with you in many of your notions, just historically knowing you and knowing what you stand for. But the experience of, let's say, of post-September 11, going in and out of the United States, crossing borders and so forth, and the way Muslims are treated in general, made me somehow become a Muslim. Growing up as a Muslim is one thing, and being well-versed, but then it makes you much more Muslim. And I have seen the rhetoric of many people who came, let's say, from Marxist secular background, who are Muslims. You take Mahmoud Mamdani, suddenly identify as Muslim. Maybe their arguments are interesting and so forth, and propagated, or pushed, or came as a result of that kind of experience. But you find them in the process, whether they like it or not, or I will make it clear that they identify as Muslim as a result of a certain experience that make you, even in solidarity to some extent, with the inhuman treatment, sometimes even the worst kind of the so-called terrorists, or people who commit atrocities. And when you think about, the way Muslims are treated, even if they're Taliban, that you disagree with them politically, there is a level of sympathy that comes there. And I think the idea, identifying as a result of an experience, sometimes negative, may make you empathize even with the worst Wahhabi or Taliban or others that you talk about.
I don't think it will make me empathize in a way that I would not empathize otherwise. By that I mean this, that the point I was making about West Pakistanis killing East Pakistanis, and West Pakistanis army raping West Pakistani Muslim women, is to debunk the notion of the Ummah. To say that it is ridiculous to talk about something called the Ummah that unite the people, which drove them to break away from India at the cost of millions of lives, only to be killing each other a couple of decades later on. So that was that. But it is not to belittle the suffering or the anger and frustration of all sort of against all sort of atrocities that are committed all the time against all sort of people. And again here, I think I said it earlier in my remarks, that we tend to empathize with people like us. That we don't identify as much with people who do not really in our, although if we are confronted with the question, we would think differently. Or we do, no. And honestly, when we deny it, we will really think that we are denying it. But really seriously, when we think about the suffering that has been going on in Congo, for the last 10 years, 5 million people killed, hundreds of thousands of women raped, and still going on. It doesn't register in our consciousness, it doesn't outrage us as much as the experience of being subjected to humiliation, crossing a border, or carrying Sudanese passport. And it is not to say that, so my point is that I think it is common, which is why we need to get out of it. It is not a way of acknowledging that reality so that we can stay with it, but to say that this is wrong and we should try to create broader solidarity so that if Mamdani or yourself or anybody else is now self-identifying as a Muslim, that's all I need to hear. And I'm not going to tell that person, no, you are not a Muslim. That's fine. You identify yourself as a Muslim, that's fine. But I'm saying for me and for you and everybody else, let us equally self-identify as human. With human suffering everywhere, whoever the victim and whoever the perpetrator. That we should not be sort of emphasizing with victims against perpetrators in one sense, in one setting, and emphasizing with perpetrators against victims in other settings. So that when we see that atrocities committed, we should stand outraged equally, whoever the victim happens to be, regardless of our religious or ethnic or other type of affiliation or lack of it with that person. I think my point is made, and if I overstate the point, I regret and I'm sorry for that. But the point I am trying to make is this, to say that self-identify as a Muslim is, as I said, sufficient for an identity marker, but it is not exclusive of anything else I might be, and should not be taken to be sort of diminishing or belittling any other type of identity any other person may want to have. That would be the point I would want to make.
Well, one of my identities is as moderator of the session. So in that identity, I will thank you all for attending and also invite you warmly to join us in the reception. We can continue this conversation. It's been a great discussion. So the reception is in the History of Art Gallery.
We just follow you.
Next door. And why don't we say thank you once again to our